morning. This is good. Very encouraging to see people coming out, understanding how important these topics are. It's kind of a struggle. You know, myself, an organizer of events, I organize a monthly program up in the Seattle area in Bothell, and a conference every year and these kind of things. And it's a struggle to get people to recognize the importance, the significance of this. You know, churches tend to be New Testament churches today, and don't teach a lot of Old Testament anymore, and don't really see that, I guess, the importance of upholding that part of God's Word. But Jesus says, I'd spoken to you of earthly things and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? An important passage. If we can't trust what the Bible says on these historical matters, these important events like those that took place in Genesis, not just the creation itself, but the flood, just how many Christians today waver on whether or not that event even happened, much less that it was a global event. All the high mountains and the whole heavens are covered. But if we can't trust what it says on these earthly matters, these historical matters, how can we trust what it says later on matters such as salvation? It's a critically important thing that people today be able to defend their faith. And this subject is important here too. This is one of those critical issues. Much like the fossil record itself, when people started seeing different interpretations of the fossil record, that convinced them that this must not be the result of the global flood and caused them to start seriously questioning that part of the biblical history. This one as well was one of those subjects that caused a great many Christians to become convinced that evolution must be true. Because a lot of people can accept that organisms change through time. I mean, we recognize that now. The breeding histories that we see illustrate just how much change is possible within any of these animals that God created. A tremendous amount of change is possible. Does it occur through random mutations? Nah, that's ridiculous. But God has created these organisms with the ability to evolve and adapt to the various environments that we see on Earth in a very rapid manner, highly specialized to particular ecological needs. This is what we're really seeing, not random productions of variations in natural selection. But this was one of the things. When people saw what they considered to be credible evidence of human evolution, well then all of evolution must be true. If we've evolved from apes, then the whole thing must be true. It must be true that all life on Earth has descended from one common ancestor. If we've evolved from apes, then that's it. That's the big piece of it right there. And there's a lot of Christians really got hung up here. I don't know if my dad ever really believed in evolution, but I know the name Australopithecus afarensis because from my dad. Either he thought that was just a really cool sounding word, and spitting that out made him sound but I know that name from my dad, and we grew up in the church. I mean, I was Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. We worked on the buses, bus ministry on Saturday, ensemble. I was even in the handbell choir when I was in high school, if you can believe that. High school senior in the handbell choir. That's when it was cool to be in the handbell choir, apparently. So, human evolution. We're going to be looking at this issue. Now, understand that this subject is taught as very matter-of-fact. Very matter-of-fact terminology today. Prentice Hall Biology describes human evolution like this. Now, Prentice Hall Biology is the most widely used biology textbook used in public schools. Without question. Prentice Hall Biology. And listen how they describe human evolution. It's very matter-of-fact. Humans and other primates evolved from a common ancestor that lived more than 65 million years ago. Matter-of-fact. It's not speculation. Speculation is not theoretical. Between 6 and 7 million years ago, the hominoid line gave rise to a branch that ultimately led to the ancestors and closer relatives of modern humans. Very matter-of-fact terminology. But what we have to remember is that what scientists are teaching us today are not facts. What they're teaching us is interpretations of scientific findings, not facts. They are teaching us interpretations of scientific findings. And a person's interpretation of findings or observations is axiomatic. Your presuppositions, your axioms, your worldview determine how you interpret scientific findings. What we're being taught today is an interpretation of scientific findings based on naturalism. The scientific community has adopted a worldview of naturalism. They argue that all physical phenomena that we observe must be explained as happening through purely natural processes, and that the origin of everything we see must have come into existence through purely natural processes. And they're diligently trying to find evidence to help them explain our world through such a worldview, through a worldview of pure naturalism. This is the view of the scientific community. And we dangerously accept such interpretations. How can a person with a flawed worldview correctly interpret scientific findings? We need to have a healthy skepticism of what science is teaching us today, and particularly with regard to origins related issues. We need to have a healthy skepticism. If we want to know the truth, if we want to know the true history of the world, we must interpret scientific findings ourselves consistent with the biblical worldview. We don't allow an atheist to interpret scientific findings, no matter how many of them are in agreement about that, and then assume that's true. And then look to the Bible to see how we can maybe twist it around so it's not in conflict. Resolving the conflicts that exist between science and the Bible today are very important, but we can't do that by accepting an atheistic interpretation of findings and then look to the Bible to see how we can force it to not be in conflict. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people do. We must interpret scientific findings ourselves. That's why having good knowledge of science is important today for the church. You must understand the science well enough to be able to interpret those findings from the biblical worldview. It's critical that we be able to do this. It's very important that people educate themselves in science and in how science can correctly support the Bible. It's very, very critical. But today, what the scientific community teaches is that we are nothing but another animal. That life evolved on Earth from simple to complex forms. All life on Earth has evolved from one common ancestral cell, and then ultimately, we evolved from ape-like ancestors after a lineage of progress like this. But that we are just another animal. The Bible itself, though, is in stark contrast to this, so that we are the pinnacle of the creation. All of the creation was created for one purpose and one person only, and that is for us. God created all this just for us. When I consider your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and honor. We are the pinnacle of the creation itself. We're not just another animal. We are a spiritual being inhabiting for a period of time a mortal body. We are distinct from the creation itself. We're created in the image of God. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps along the ground. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. But Christians that accept the naturalistic view of Earth history and then look to the Bible to see how we can force it to not be in conflict, find themselves on a slippery slope regarding human evolution. Regarding the origin of man, regarding Adam. One of the ways you can really test a theistic evolutionist mettle on these subjects or figure out where they stand is by asking them what their view is on Adam. Their view on the flood, critical. Their view on Adam, probably the second most important issue for a theistic evolution to deal with. There are two typical views on Adam himself. One is that Adam was not a real man. That's the most typical, the most commonly accepted view of Adam from a theistic evolutionist is that Adam was not a real man at all. The name Adam just means man, and so they take the view that that entire story was just allegorical, taught to help us understand humanity and our relationship with God and ethical, moral truths, these kind of stuff, but that Adam was not a real man. Slippery slope that you place yourself on with such a view, because if Adam was not a real man, who was the first real man? When does the Bible become real? When does it become real history? When does it move from allegorical to real history? Who was the first real man? Because we have a genealogical record. It says who Adam's sons were and who his Seth's sons were, and on and on and on. We have this genealogical record. If Adam was not a real man, who was the first real man? It's the most common view. The second most common view is that God created humans from ape-like ancestors, a view that is espoused by people such as Bill Dembski. You might know Bill Dembski, an intelligent design advocate, very, very brilliant man. I've read several of his books, but he takes the view that God created Adam from an ape-like hominid that once Apes had evolved to a certain stage of cognitive and physical capability that God then took one of them, breathed the breath of life into him, put him in the Garden of Eden, and then Bill Dembski says that he would have given him amnesia, so he would not remember his former animal life. Reading Bill Dembski's book would have given him amnesia, but this is a common view. But I think that we teach such things with I think such teachings are very dangerous, extremely dangerous. And these are both Bill Dembski, who espouses the latter view, others that espouse the other view regarding Adam. We find these people in our Christian colleges, Christian universities. Both theology professors and science teachers teach these views. And I think it's a very dangerous thing, very dangerous thing. People, John Polkinghorne is, for example, brilliant guy. I heard a debate that he had with John Mackay once where he was talking about this view on Adam, that Adam was not a real man at all. But he's been teaching at Christian universities for decades. Bill Dembski as well teaches at Christian universities, teaches these views. But most of these guys have changed their views through time. You know, they go from one view to another. They change different. They know that is not what they held at earlier points in their life. That's what they currently hold to, and that's what they believe is true. So they're teaching that. But to a person to a student of theirs, they take this teaching as absolute fact. You know, not just one of many possible views. It has a much greater impact and influence on who it's taught to than on the person who really holds to that view and is teaching it themselves. Because they know it's one of many views. They know that their views have changed through time. It's a very, very dangerous thing that these do, that by teaching these things. I just don't think we can reconcile these at all. These views on ape-men and the views on the Bible. Humans have evolved from apes. I just don't see that in the Bible. And we're given a number of warnings. Jesus, when he quotes Isaiah, he says that this people honors me not with their lips, but they honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. If we teach as doctrines the precepts of men rather than standing on the word of God, theistic evolution, depending on where people stand, it's all a matter of where you place authority. Do you place your authority with man and the precepts of man, or do you place your authority with God's word? You know, do we trust in it as authoritative on early Earth's history, or do we trust the precepts of man and teach? And that's what we do. We teach. They're teaching these as doctrine. We are to no longer be like children, tossed here and there by waves and carried by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. We have to test for ourselves what is true and what is not. The search for truth is like one of our ultimate goals. I mean, what is the truth? There's a lot of views out there. People are teaching all kinds of various views, but there's only one truth. And if we want to know the truth, if we want to know the true history of the world, again, I say it, we must interpret scientific findings ourselves, consistent with the biblical worldview. We can't let an atheist interpret scientific findings. I mean, these people are not dumb. The scientists are crazy smart, and the community is seemingly in agreement about these issues. This is very convincing to people that so many smart people are in agreement, seemingly unanimous agreement about these issues. Can be very convincing. But we need to figure out for ourselves what the truth is. The truth is out there, but it's muddled in a whole bunch of misinformation. It's out there, but you got to search diligently for it. And it's amazing just how lost the world is. The world is lost, not just lost in not knowing the salvation message, but lost regarding the history of the world. How do we get to this point? The world's not that old. How do we get to the point where people have such a skewed perspective on Earth history? Such a flawed perspective on Earth's history. And I'll say the flood itself is critically important in correctly understanding Earth's history. If a person doesn't understand the flood and its impact on the geology of the world, they don't understand Earth history at all. They are lost. They are so far off from what the true history of the world is, it's incredible. But I think the best place is when we start analyzing ape-men is to kind of look at a little history first. So look at a few examples. Some of the examples that, again, convinced a great many people that evolution must be true. These are some of the examples that convinced people. When they saw what they considered to be credible evidence of human evolution, well, that was it. Yeah, evolution must be true. So maybe I need to look at the Bible again and see how that can be interpreted in light of these new truths. Nebraska man, shown here, was discovered in western Nebraska in 1922. Media reports flooded classrooms, and it was used in school textbooks for years. It was even presented as evidence in the Scopes trial. You know the Scopes trial? Famous historical trial that was put on by the ACLU. Basically orchestrated this trial, put out newspaper ads to get someone to challenge the Butler Act and at least say they had taught human evolution in public schools, to challenge the Butler Act so they could put on a big media circus trial. This was one of the evidences used as support in the Scopes trial. Here's an illustration shown here in the Illustrated London News. Notice all the detail. But for this fossil discovery, they did not have a complete skeleton, a complete skull, or even a complete jawbone. No complete skeleton, no complete skull, no complete jawbone. All they managed to find was a single molar tooth. But look at all the detail you can get from apparently a single molar tooth. Not only do you know what Nebraska man looks like, but you apparently know what his wife looks like too, just from a single molar tooth. But it turned out that this molar tooth did not belong to a human at all. Full investigation was finally published several years later, and it turned out that it didn't belong to a human or even an ape, but it turned out to belong to a pig, an extinct peccary. But this is not an isolated incident. More recently, a collarbone, a human collarbone, was misinterpreted from what was actually a dolphin rib. Tim White reports that a 5 million year old piece of bone that was thought to be a collarbone of a human-like creature is actually part of a dolphin rib. He named the find Flipperpithecus. The problem, he says, with a lot of anthropologists is that they want so much to find a hominid that any scrap of bone becomes a hominid bone. And we can find this repeatedly throughout these investigations. Scraps of animals have been reported to be hominids that belong not only to pigs and dolphins, but also alligators, horse, bear, elephant, and donkey. Nigel Hawkes, who was a science correspondent and health editor for the Times newspaper in London, stated that few sciences produce such abundant returns from so few fragments of fact as paleontology. And this is true. In 1911, Piltdown Man was discovered. This is actually a stage photograph, but shows Charles Dawson digging in the gravel pits near Piltdown, England, where Piltdown Man was discovered. They found pieces of a human skull from this gravel pit. He also claimed that he found an ape-like lower jaw and human-like teeth. In 1912, it was announced that Darwin's missing link had been found. The discovery was published in the New York Times under the headline, "Darwin's Theory Proved True." For 40 years, from 1912 to 1953, Piltdown Man reigned supreme in our classrooms, textbooks, and museums. Scores of books, pamphlets, and articles were published about Piltdown Man. Models like this, diagrams, were some of the most convincing proofs of human evolution during this period. When people saw these, evolution must be true. If they have indeed found this, evolution must be true. All of evolution. People were challenged and questioned the authority of the Bible based on such claims. For 40 years, it reigned true. But it took a full 40 years before the finding was finally revealed to be a fraud. The teeth had been filed down to make them look more human-like, and the bones had been treated with chemicals to increase their appearance of their age. Once this was finally reported, according to critics, the file marks on the teeth were so obvious, it was stated that they had to be willfully ignored. Willfully ignored. It's as if that thing was allowed to stand until they had something else to take its place. When that's all the evidence you have, you're going to keep it as evidence until you have something better, and I think that's what they did. But probably the most important piece of evidence to support human evolution was not a fossil at all. It was an illustration. This is arguably the most recognized scientific illustration of all time. This diagram was affectionately called the March of Progress. It was part of a Time Life book series. The poster itself was included within one of the books, but it was also sent out as a publicity tool throughout the world to schools, libraries, institutions, other institutions of academia. This poster was sent out as to publicize or promote this book series. And it made its way into classrooms, hung on walls of libraries. It's the most recognizable scientific illustration of all time. It's called the March of Progress because, as you can see, it shows not just an evolutionary progression, but hominids and the progress of walking. Even Stephen Jay Gould remarked that it was a canonical representation of evolution, the one picture immediately grasped and viscerally understood by all. The diagram has been reproduced countless times, parodied countless times. A convincing diagram, to be sure. The one problem with the diagram was that it was knowingly false. It was knowingly false. The author even mentions this on fine print. He states that although proto-apes and apes were quadrupedal, means they walked on all four, they are shown here standing for comparison. Shown standing for comparison. He knew they were quadrupeds, but again, he doesn't just show them standing, they're shown walking. They're shown walking in bipedal motion. That's why it was called the March of Progress. The fact is that there is a significant difference between human apes, and the difference is largely due to the fact that apes are quadrupeds. They were what we call knuckle walkers, where humans are bipeds. Notice that here from this diagram, I took this straight out of Prentice Hall Biology just to illustrate some of the differences. But all the differences shown here, between quadrupeded biped, the differences are so significant they impact literally almost every part of the skeletal system. The back is straight in humans. It's an S-shaped spinal column instead of C-shaped that we see in apes. This is important for the upright posture of bipeds. To have the torso and the head directly above the hips is important. The position of the skull, where it attaches to the spinal cord, is also different. In humans, the spinal cord attaches to the skull at the bottom, where in apes, it attaches to the back. Humans also have a fully extendable hip and angled femur bones. This is important. When looking at the humans from the front, the femur bones are angled inwards as they come down from the hip. This is important to put the feet directly beneath the body, so that when humans walk, the feet are always, if you notice how humans walk, the feet are always directly beneath the body. During walking and running, you're supported by just one leg at a time. And so without this angled femur, the body would kind of topple from side to side. Very important. But there's others as well. We have much finer balance control by the way of the inner ear than the apes have. We also have a flat face. One of the distinctive differences between the apes and the humans is apes have what's called a shovel face. Humans have a very flat face in comparison. As a biped, you have to have a flat face in order to be able to see the ground beneath you. Very important. We also have very long legs and very short arms. The exact opposite can be found in apes. Apes have very long arms. Arched feet are also very important. You have an arch between the ball of your foot and the toe, and this is very important. There's 26 bones in the feet alone. All of these bones are very, very necessary to accomplish the balance of bipeds, but the arched foot is a very important part of that. It makes it so that a person can press down on the ball of the foot, and this is important for both balance and control, for running, for changing directions. The arch of your foot is very important. Apes don't have this. Instead, they have a foot that is capable of grasping, much like their hands. Very important. Also, the strong big toe. All of these characteristics are unique to bipeds and distinct from the apes. Taxonomically, your ape-men, what we call ape-men, can be lumped into two main groups. And understand that there are many that have been found that have been given other names. This is just a brief list, but notice that there are two main genera of these ape-men shown in this diagram, and notice another reproduction of the famous March of Progress shown here. But within this, you see the two main genera. One we call the Australopithecines, and there are a number of Australopithecines that have been found. We also have the other genus, this is a taxonomic genus, the genus Homo. And within the genus Homo, we find groups such as Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and others that are not listed here, for example, Homo ergaster, antecessor, heidelbergensis, floriensis, rudolfensis. There's a number of Homo species that are not illustrated here, a number of Australopithecines that are not illustrated here either. And there are others that have been found given other names. But what you have within the paleontological community is generally with two main groups. They call the lumpers and the splitters. You have lumpers and splitters. The lumpers are the people that tend to find fossils and put them into groups that already exist. The splitters are the ones that give their discoveries new names. Okay? Your splitters tend to be the people that find a fossil. The lumpers tend to be the ones that analyze other people's finds. Because in the scientific community today, the best way to become famous is to find a fossil of an ape-man. And particularly a fossil of an ape-man that tells something new, that causes a revision of the existing scheme, or one that is earlier. Okay? To find the 200th Homo erectus fossil, it's not even going to be reported. But you find something and you call it a new species, boom, you're going to find for example, Louis Leakey. You might know the name Louis Leakey. He introduced the names Zinjanthropus, Kenyapithecus, and also Homo habilis, emphasizing the uniqueness of those fossils. But most of these have been reclassified again as Australopithecines. Homo habilis, the one there in the center, Louis Leakey named the Homo habilis, it is widely regarded within the creation community and even amongst in your secular paleontologists as well as possibly being a mixture of ape and human fossils. So I've intentionally put it on the middle there because it's probably a little bit of both. Okay? But this illustrates how we make ape-men. Okay, so where do we get these ape-men from? If we really just have apes, the creation community in general regards Australopithecines, your genus Australopithecus, as being apes, and the genus Homo as largely being represented by humans. So where did we get these supposed ape-men from? Well, there's three ways you can create an ape-man. You can do what they did in the case of Homo habilis. You can combine ape fossils with human fossils and declare the two to be one individual, a real ape-man. Another way, you can emphasize human-like qualities of fossilized apes. And with some creative imagination, you can upgrade the apes to be more human-like. That's one way you can create an ape-man, at least in illustrations, right? Or you can emphasize ape-like qualities of fossilized humans, and with some imagination, downgrade humans to be more ape-like. This is another way you can create an ape-man. And we can see that this is how it's been done. By way of exaggeration, illustration, you can transform these groups. Now, the Australopithecines, we're going to look at these two main groups, Australopithecines, and then we will look at the genus Homo as well, represented by Neanderthals, Homo erectus. We will look at some of these. Australopithecines, several important groups are in here. Australopithecus afarensis, which is best probably known for the initial discovery of Lucy. Australopithecus africanus, the Tang skull, misplaced. There's a couple there. You might remember the Nutcracker Man was discovered. It was named Pithecanthropus, formerly Zinjanthropus, Pithecanthropus, and now Australopithecus. So they've given new names in the beginning, and eventually someone realizes, oh no, that's just another Australopithecus. So now Nutcracker Man is just back to being an Australopithecus. Boisei, Australopithecus boisei, formerly Zinjanthropus. But we're going to look at Australopithecines. So Australopithecines, best known, are probably best remembered from the original discovery, the first discovery of an Australopithecus, and that was the discovery of Lucy in 1974. Australopithecus afarensis was discovered by Donald Johanson in Ethiopia in 1974. It was reported to be 40% complete, but you can see the original skeleton there, which was by no means even close to 40% complete. Apparently, the claim of 40% complete was by not including the bones of the feet and hands into this number. Actually, it's closer to 20% complete. It was dated to be about 3 million years old, and it was claimed to be a biped, meaning to have walked upright. Biped, 2 feet, quadruped, walked on 4 feet. A number of reconstructions have been made. You can see these in museums across the world. This is Australopithecus afarensis, a reconstruction from the Las Vegas Natural History Museum. Natural History Museum. So, naturalism, okay? I want to emphasize this at this point. I don't know why. This is a rabbit trail for sure, but natural history museums, and even some creation museums are calling themselves natural history museums. Remember, a scientific community has adopted a position of naturalism, okay? Naturalism. That's why we call our science, that's why we call it natural science. Natural science, science based on naturalism. That's why we call our museums natural history museums. And it's based on naturalism, history based on naturalism. That's why we call that out there nature. But I argue that's not nature. That's not natural out there. That is a result of a supernatural act of creation, a remarkable, beautiful, spectacular world created just for us. How can people not see it? That what we are experiencing here, this thing we call life, this world we find ourselves living on is wondrous. It's marvelous. Doesn't it just cry out that I was made special and perfect and beautiful just for you? Natural History Museums. Lucy also came on tour at the Pacific Science Center a few years ago. I took my apologetics class. I teach apologetics at the high school level, at the college level, classes, Sunday school and all. I took my, you can see me in the background right there, took my apologetics class to see the Lucy exhibit when it came to the Pacific Science Center back in 2009. And they actually had Lucy there, and there was a reconstruction there. But a couple of observations I note that nowhere did they have the fully. By the time this exhibit went on tour, they had found a lot of other pieces of Australopithecus afarensis, but they didn't have a full reconstruction of everything that had been found. You can see these skeletal reconstructions where they have two different colors mixed in there. You can see the pieces that were real, and these are different colored to show the pieces that have been kind of filled in. But nowhere did they have a full reconstruction of the skeleton, which I thought was very suspicious or telling. But another thing that I thought was very cool, that Ethiopian government required, in order to take Lucy on a tour, which belongs to Ethiopia, in order to take it on a tour, they also forced them to include the history of Ethiopia as part of the exhibit, which was almost entirely the Christian history of Ethiopia. So they mixed this exhibit about Lucy. You go in and all about these enormous churches in Ethiopia and the history and all. I thought it was kind of cool. Another reconstruction shown here. This is a reconstruction shown at the Living World exhibit in St. Louis at the St. Louis Zoo. And notice in particular, I'll give you another look at the feet here, but it has very human-like hands and feet. And notice a very pensive gaze too, as it ponders maybe its upcoming patent pending. Not sure what it's gazing at there. Fingers and toes of the models are straight. The hands and feet are clearly human-like. At the exhibit that came to Pacific Science Center, also very human-like hands and feet were there. This thing is very small. It's only like a 3 foot tall, this kind of thing. The problem with it was, by the time this exhibit was created and others, it was already known that Lucy did not have human-like hands and feet, that their hands and feet were very curved and very ape-like. Studies had already been done and shown this to be true. In 1983, Jack Stern and Randall Sussman, paleontologists at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, published findings arguing that they had very ape-like hands and feet. Now, they believe that they are transitional forms between apes and humans, but they summarize it this way, that the morphological and functional affinities of the hand fossil, they said, leads inexorably to an image of a suspensory adapted hand, one designed for hanging, surprisingly similar to the hands in the small end of the pygmy chimpanzee, common chimpanzee range. So these are even closer to pygmy chimpanzees than they are regular chimpanzees. And they continue. They say there's no evidence that any extant living primate has long, curved, heavily muscled hands and feet for any purpose other than to meet the demands of full or part-time arboreal life in the trees. Their shoulders were also much more suited for living in the trees, what we call brachiation, for swinging from branch to branch. The shoulder socket of afarensis is sharply angled, you'll see here. Humans are vertically oriented. This clearly indicates that they are arboreally adaptive for life in the trees. In 2000, it was reported that they had wrists capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking. Afarensis and anamensis, later represented by the famous skeleton known as Lucy, had wrists capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking. This was reported in both Science, News, and the journal Nature under the title Lucy on the Grounds with Knuckles. That might require some explanation. The original name Lucy came from, according to reports, the night after its discovery, they were playing Beatles. And the song Lucy on the Sky with Diamonds came on, and someone had the bright idea to call their discovery Lucy. So Lucy on the Ground with Knuckles. There you get the connection there. Their pelvis bones were also very similar to chimps. Note, the iliac blade of humans goes back to front, whereas in apes, the iliac blades flare out laterally. The orientation, again, is significant for maintaining posture during bipedal motion. Afarensis definitely had chimp-like hips. Stern and Sussman noted this as well. They say the fact that the anterior portion of the iliac blade faces laterally in humans but not in chimpanzees is obvious. The marked resemblance of Lucy to the chimpanzee is equally obvious. It suggests to us, they say, that the mechanism of lateral pelvic balance during bipedalism was closer to that in apes than in humans. They were definitely ape-like. But what do? If you have an ape fossil and you want it to be a biped, but all evidence shows it is a quadruped, has a hip of a quadruped, and you want that thing to be a biped, what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is you can modify your fossil. You can take that fossil in the workroom and you can hack apart pieces and glue that thing back together until you have something that's going to walk upright. That's what you can do. Now, this may seem facetious, but this is exactly what one anthropologist did. Owen Lovejoy, who is the chairman of anthropology at Kent State University, basically does this kind of reconstruction in you can see this in a PBS Nova series video from 1994 called In Search of Humans. Watch what Owen Lovejoy does here.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together.
So he believes that the hip had been broken and then just fossilized back into its present form. So he decides to fix that.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Make the evidence fit your view. That's what you do. Yeah. The skull of Lucy is also extremely ape-like. Notice the sloping shovel face of Lucy that's typical of apes. The canine teeth are also come in at an angle, excuse me, unlike humans, which come in more straight. The cranial capacity of afarensis is even smaller than a typical ape. They don't have nasal bones, very ape-like. The jaw of Australopithecines is much similar to a chimp than humans. I'll note here. Also note the point of attachment of the spine, where the spine fits into the skull. I noted this previously, which in humans, remember, it merges in the center, whereas in apes, it fits into the back. Australopithecines also had a semicircular canal, which, remember, is important for balance, similar to that possessed by chimps, and a large external ear hole like we see in apes. And many of these observations are not new. In fact, renowned scientists have been arguing against Australopithecines as a human ancestor for decades. For example, 1958, Ashley Montagu, a British American anthropologist who taught at Princeton, Rutgers, University of California, New York University, denied that Australopithecine was a human ancestor. He said the skull form of all Australopithecines is extremely ape-like. The Australopithecines show too many specialized and ape-like characteristics to be either the direct ancestor of man or of the line that led to man. 1970, Lord Zuckerman, a professor of anatomy at Birmingham University in England, and who was the chief scientific advisor to the British government, said, "I find myself totally unpersuaded. Almost always when I've tried to check the anatomical claims of which the status of Australopithecus is based, I've been in failure. The Australopithecine skull is in fact so overwhelmingly simian as opposed to human that the contrary proposition could be equated to an assertion that black is white. It is about as far from the truth as you could possibly get." But what do? You take your ape-like fossils and you, through creative imagination, you exaggerate human-like qualities of those. That's what they do. And that's what we see in these reconstructions. We don't see an exact reconstruction. We see what either the scientist or perhaps even the artist they read into it what they want to be there. And this is even admitted. A reconstruction was done of Australopithecus afarensis for the National Geographic edition in March 1996, shown here. And the artist even admitted that it wasn't an exact reproduction. He says, "I wanted to get a human soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where she was headed." It's not an exact reproduction. It's not an honest replication of what they had found. She wanted to get a human-like soul into that ape-like face. Intentionally made the ape-like face human-like to make so that it indicated something about where she was headed, not where she was, where they believed she was headed. The reality is Australopithecines are apes. They share all the characteristics that we see amongst apes, such as chimpanzees, and almost none share with humans. The brain size overlaps chimpanzees. Jaws are similar to chimpanzees. They have the long arms, identical to chimpanzees. Lower leg bone is similar. Large back muscles for tree dwelling. Hands similar, even more similar to the pygmy chimpanzees than regular chimpanzees. An ape-like foot capable of grasping. Fingers and toes were long and curved. Locking wrists. Again, they're not what they call knuckle walkers. The wrists lock into place as they walk around on their knuckles. The ankle bone as well was ideally suited for tree dwelling. Charles Oxnard, who is arguably the world's foremost expert on computerized analysis of bones using digital X-ray. He's a professor of anatomy and anthropology at the University of Chicago and currently at the University of Western Australia, states that the Australopithecines are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalisms. Possibly from a place in a group any closer to humans than to African apes, and certainly from any place in the direct human lineage. But he's being a little optimistic here, because they will never be removed until there's something else to take its place. It's like Piltdown Man. It will remain, despite all the problems with this, until they have something better to take its place. And that's just what happens. Right? So Australopithecines, definitely ape-like. And then we have the genus Homo. In general, all of your ape-men can fit into one of these two groups, even though they may be originally assigned to one, oftentimes reassigned to another. Okay, and as I mentioned, there are several other species, but these are the two main ones, and oftentimes others that are discovered end up being lumped into one of these, and particularly into Homo erectus. But first, let's look at Neanderthals. This was first discovered in 1856 in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany, thus the name. Original reconstructions, drawings of the Neanderthal man had them looking very ape-like. You can see this. They are believed to have lived anywhere between 30,000 years ago and up to 600,000 years ago. The fossils of Neanderthals have been found in this region, the region you see that's green here, roughly along or south of what is called the 50th parallel north. This is just south of where the Ice Age glaciers advanced to during the Ice Age. Creation geologists like Michael Ord has spoken on this a number of times, describes the Ice Age as forming during the tail end of the flood due to the conditions that were present there, and these vast glaciers advanced down into this region. But you can see how the fossils there fit perfectly right along the edge of what is called the 50th parallel north. So they lived up in this very, very cold period during the Ice Age. They are characterized by one of the main characteristics of what we would call these ancient hominids, possibly both Neanderthals and Homo erectus, is that they had what are called robust bones. They had very thick bones. Very thick bones, as opposed to modern humans that are distinct and having gracile bones. So when I talk about modern humans, we're talking about finds that have gracile, modern-like bones, as opposed to robust bones that are typically classified as these ancient hominids, putting them back 30,000, 300,000 years old. Robust bones. But in addition, they had thick, very thick, as I said, bones, and they had brow ridges. You see here, big brow ridges above their brows, and they had stocky body builds, short extremities. But remember, one of the ways that you make an ape-man is you can take ape-like fossils and emphasize the human-like qualities, or you can take human-like fossils and emphasize the ape-like qualities. One of the ways that they've done this with Neanderthals, with skull finds in general, is through the positioning of the jaw in relation to the skull. Remember, one of the distinctions between the ape skull and the human skull is that the apes have that shovel face, and where humans have a very flat face. However, when the skull cap ends up being one of the fossils of the head that is found most often. Oftentimes they find the skull cap and they find the jawbone. But many of the other bones that make up the face, including the point attachments for the jawbone, are often absent. And so a paleontologist has a skull cap and perhaps even a jawbone, and then they have to decide for themselves where that jawbone fits. Does it fit back here, making it look more human-like, or do I slide it out here, giving it more shovel-like appearance? Jack Cuozzo, in his book Buried Alive, Jack Cuozzo, retired orthodontist who managed to get access to several Neanderthal skulls over in France, and I believe Germany as well, with his credentials as a retired doctor and with a portable x-ray machine, managed to x-ray several Neanderthal skulls. Something I very seriously doubt that anyone could do today. Today, there's a very much closed group society within paleontology. You can't examine someone else's fossils unless you have fossils of your own, of similar types. So you can examine yours, mine, if I can examine yours kind of situation. But he managed to get into the museums over in France where these Neanderthals were being housed, close to where they were discovered, and was able to analyze these through x-ray, nonetheless. And so that book could be interesting read if you want to find it, Buried Alive. Anyway, while he was doing some of this research, he found this diagram. This is of a famous Neanderthal teenager that had been discovered back in 1909. I would try to pronunciate the name of that, but my limited French I'd probably butcher that, so I'm not going to try. But that's a famous fossil of a teenage Neanderthal. Nonetheless, when he saw this diagram as a retired orthodontist, a human anatomist, he realized something immediately wrong with the diagram, and that is that the jaw on this diagram was positioned fully out of socket. The jaw itself is extended a full 30 millimeters beyond where it would normally be. The jawbone fits into this little groove right here called the fossa. And people have reported just seeing paleontologists do this. I have a skull cap and I have a jawbone, and where do I position it? You know, do I have the illustrator position it out here? Do I have it positioned back here? It's more human-like with a flat face, more ape-like with the shovel face. Depending on where you place his jaw, you can emphasize the ape-like qualities of human-like fossils, and this is what they do. Because positioned back where it would normally be, you're going to have a very flat face, a face that looks much more human-like, which we now know is what the Neanderthals really look like. They're very human-like. A number of Neanderthal reconstructions can be seen in museums now that have them looking almost indistinguishable from modern humans, with the exception of a little bit of a brow ridge there. You see this one here? This is from the Mettmann Museum in Germany. Again, the Neanderthals were big game hunters. We have found them buried with like trophies from hunts. We know they hunted mammoths. These are not just something we see in movies, but we've actually found them with trophies from their mammoth hunts. So they're big game hunters, even hunting things like mammoths, again, that lived in very harsh, cold climates just south of the glaciers during the Ice Age period. But these reconstructions have them looking very human-like. This is a reconstruction of the famous Gibraltar child that was discovered in 1926. Far different from the original drawings of Neanderthal that we had seen. Eric Tinkus, who is a renowned anthropologist, any new find, oftentimes you can see Eric Tinkus having been consulted with regarding this new discovery. He's an anthropologist at Washington University and an expert on Neanderthal biology. He states that detailed comparison of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there is nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. They were modern humans. V. Sodera is a human anatomist with 3 books on human surgical techniques. He said, despite their stocky body build and their stocky skull shape, there is no hard evidence to say that Neanderthals were in any way inferior intellectually to modern man. They are known to have made sophisticated flint tools. They built huts out of animal skins, and they even had control over fire. They also buried their dead. And this is significant because we recognize burial to be a very religious act. It's a very ceremonial thing, a very religious act. Marvin Lubenow also comments on this, but even makes a more significant observation. He has a book called Bones of Contention. Awesome. I would highly recommend Marvin Lubenow's book, Bones of Contention. He states that most anthropologists recognize burial as a very human and very religious act. He said, but the strongest evidence that Neanderthals were fully human and of our own species is that at 4 sites, Neanderthals and modern humans were found buried together. They found Neanderthals buried together with modern humans. Again, the distinction being the gracile, the thinner bones, as opposed to the thick bones we see in Neanderthals. But last, probably one of the most significant discoveries to add to the argument that Neanderthals were just humans and of our own species was the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. They've been working on this over several years, but in 2009, the sequencing was finally complete, and it was published in the journal Science in 2010, following a comparison of the Neanderthal genome with several modern human populations. They compared the Neanderthal genome to both Africans, French, Chinese, and even Papuans, Papua New Guinea, the islands around Papua New Guinea. They found that 99.7% of the base pairs of the Neanderthal genome are identical to modern humans. 99.9% identical. They also found several distinct markers, Neanderthal markers, present in these human populations, in both the French and Chinese and those from Papua New Guinea. They found Neanderthal markers specifically in those, which conclusively demonstrated that there had been interbreeding between the groups. They have not as yet found any of the markers in African populations. And kind of an interesting side note, they've never found Neanderthal fossils or remains in China or in the New Guinea region. So although they have found evidence of interbreeding within these groups, so that must have preceded their movement into these areas. Just kind of an interesting side note. At this point, we know that the initial reconstructions were terribly, terribly wrong. That Neanderthals were, by all accounts, fully human, 100% human. Brain capacity was even slightly larger than modern Homo sapiens. We know they used jewelry, they used musical instruments, made cave paintings. The number of cave paintings that's now been found is just grown enormously. We know they buried their dead, even with trophies and artifacts. And we know that they interbred, given some recent evidence from DNA sequencing. I found this. When I was poking around, I found this diagram of Wikipedia. This is actually Homo erectus, which is the subject of our next talk. But it helps me segue into these. I found this on Wikipedia. Again, what they typically find is just a skull cap, oftentimes a jawbone as well. But I noticed this jawbone also positions completely out of socket for this Homo erectus. Another example of the manipulation of data to get it to fit our preconceptions. Even Homo erectus are manipulated in this way. Homo erectus, the name means erect man. They were first discovered in 1891. To date, more than 280 fossilized individuals have been found. The first to be discovered was this guy right here, Java man. Only a skull cap was found, no jaw, no facial bones. But again, just depending on where you place that jaw, you can give this guy a more shovel face, or if you put it back where it's supposed to be, give it a flatter face. This just was discovered by Eugene Dubois near Java Island in Indonesia. It was the first to have been discovered and is arguably the best known human fossil. And this, probably more than anything else, was one of the key evidences to convince a great many people that evolution must be true. These are illustrations and a model from 1922. It was discovered by, again, Eugene Dubois, who was a former student of Ernst Haeckel, who you might know from the embryo fake fame. He discovered the fossil while serving as, I'm not trying to remember, he was serving in the medical corps in the Dust East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and while serving in the medical corps, managed to get permission to go out and dig for fossils. He was granted permission, was given 50 forced laborers and 2 corporals to accompany him, but none of them had any experience in digging fossils. So there was a lot of criticism of this later because there was very little very poor record keeping as to exactly which strata these fossils were found in. But what they ultimately found was a skull cap, you see here, a tooth, and then later, remember exactly how much later they found it, they found this femur. They found a femur in the same region, but at a different time, and the femur was distinct from the skull cap. The femur was gracile, obviously modern in comparison to the skull cap. So there was a lot of criticism over this from the very beginning as to whether or not this was an ancient hominid or not. The skull cap did not look at all human-like. The femur bone looked identical to modern humans, and so there was a lot of criticism in the beginning. Dubois assumed that they belonged to the same individual, but the differences between them were so significant that it caused criticism from the beginning, and a lot of people contested the claim. But a later discovery of Peking man kind of put these criticisms to rest as to whether or not the skull cap actually belonged to an ancient hominid. Peking man, originally, or what is better known as Homo erectus pekinensis, was discovered in the Zadokian cave system. The entrance to it is shown here. It's now listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I'll give you another look at the monument to Peking man shown there in the entrance. You know, I have to wonder what this poor fellow would think if he managed to get transported ahead in time and goes to his cave and sees this statue there and thinks, man, people in the future were worshiping me like I was a god over there. It's crazy. Peking man. There's an interesting story behind this. They ended up finding 6 skull caps. 6 skull caps originally, but all of the skull caps were lost. Now, they found many Homo erectus fossils have been found since, and they even rediscovered one at this site on a later date in 1966. But the original skull caps that were discovered were lost during World War II. When Japan was invading China, they decided to move the fossils to the U.S., and they put them in the hands of some U.S. servicemen, and in the process of transporting these down to a shipping area, they disappeared. The servicemen ended up in an internment camp. No one knows what happened to fossils, but the Chinese government, even as recently as like 2005, were trying to revive interest to try to figure out what happened to the fossils. But it's just possible that whoever captured the servicemen opened up the container that they were in, and it's like, what in the world? Bunch of stupid bones, and toss them over in the ditch or something, so who knows? There's an interesting story behind it. Another interesting kind of side note here, after the discovery of these Peking man fossils, Eugene Dubois actually kind of backpedaled a little bit and claimed that his fossil was actually that of a large gibbon. Now, this is actually there's a misunderstanding. I found this newspaper article actually like yesterday from March, like 1937, announcing that Pithecanthropus, which is what it was originally called, was reassigned to an ape group. He wasn't really trying to say that it was not an ape. He fully believed that it was the first human ancestor, a human fossil. But being that others had been discovered, he wanted to make his unique. Remember, being one person of a bunch of people who had discovered the same fossils not going to help you maintain your fame. So what he did is he backpedaled and argued that his was even earlier. Oh no, mine is even earlier than those. It's like a given in comparison. But in reality, it was the same. It was a Homo erectus fossil, the first Homo erectus fossil that had been found. And they've been found over a wide area. Like I say, more than 200 have been found to date. The red dots on this diagram show you the location of where they have found fossils that match the general characteristics of individuals that we call Homo erectus. And we've also found tools at these locations. The brown area there on that map above shows the locations of where they have found a tool they call a hand axe. And this is a little bit trivia as well, but I like to add a little bit of kind of trivial stuff to some of this. I found this interesting. Anyway, they found these tools called hand axes, and you can actually see a monument of one standing there at a park in England, these hand axes. They found a whole bunch of these all over the place in these Homo erectus occupied areas. But what they were is debated at this point. They're called a hand axe because they roughly are about the size of a hand, and they look like they were used as a tool. But the reason why their purpose is debated is that if you look at these that have been found, they're beveled all the way around. They're to a point all the way around. And yet if you were going to use that as a hand axe, holding that in your hand and using that to bang on something, you would round off one side that you were using, we're going to put your hand in. So what these are actually used for has been debated. I've heard it argued that they may have actually been the left behind core of when they were making arrowheads. They would be making arrowheads, and eventually they would get down to too small of a piece, and then they would just... So I heard that one argument was that these are just the left-behind cores when people were chiseling out arrowheads. Marvin Lubenow, though, made the argument, at least I believe, made the argument that these might have been a throwing implement instead. And he drew an analogy or comparison to the discus event, which I thought was an interesting argument. Most of these sports, competitive, Olympic type events, at least especially in the early days, were all based on some activity that people would do either in war or in hunting, and even they even have these forestry events. Have you seen these guys doing? They have these forestry competitions where they get these guys out there and have to chop down a tree really fast and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they make a sport out of anything that people do for a living that you get real good at, and they'll make a competition out of it. Well, he argued that for most of those Olympic events, we can connect those directly to something that humans had done, but that discus event is kind of weird. I mean, where did people learn how to do that? That they got good at it and decided to compete at it, UFOs. Well, he argued that that's maybe how these things have been thrown, is actually discus style, that these were a large throwing implement that they would hurl at big game, create a big wound, large enough to eventually lame them and allow them. But I thought it was pretty interesting. The general characteristics of Homo erectus are these. They have, thick skulls, broad and elongated. Many have a slight ridge along the center of the skull, thick brow ridges. Many have an occipital bun, which is a kind of an enlargement on the back of the skull. Again, the cranial wall, the wall of the skull is usually very thick. Cranial capacity, slightly larger, but not slightly smaller, not significantly smaller than modern Homo sapiens. That's the characteristics here. Most reconstructions now have them looking very human-like, but again, they exaggerate, accentuate some ape-like qualities there, but what they make real obvious are the brow ridges and the sloping forehead. But these are characteristics we still can see amongst modern humans. Look at this guy right here. This is a former Russian boxer by the name of Nikolai Valuyev. I mean, clear brow ridges and even a sloping forehead. I mean, these are characteristics that we still see amongst modern humans, especially those in Eastern Europe, where many of these groups had lived. These are not characteristics that are unique to Homo erectus. And in fact, whether the cranial thickness, the thickness of the skull, is unique to Homo erectus, either has been called significantly into question. Up until recently, no data was present that had yet analyzed the thickness of the Homo erectus skull with that of modern humans. But in 1994, a substantial comparison was eventually done, comparing the thickness of the Homo erectus skull with several modern populations, and they found that it appears clear. They say that vault thickness cannot be used to distinguish Homo erectus from Homo sapiens. Vault thickness alone. When comparing the Homo erectus to several modern humans, they found that a clear overlap in the thickness. So when they find a skull, they cannot just by thickness alone identify that as Homo erectus as opposed to modern human. There's just not enough difference. The size of the skull as well. That was one characteristic that people thought was unique to Homo erectus. But a recent discovery by the published, shown here in a diagram from the National Science Foundation, this was a discovery in 2008, of a female pelvis that was classified as Homo erectus, showed that, at least from the pelvis itself, from the birth canal area of the pelvis, that the skull size of the infant was clearly within the range of modern humans. Modern human children have a cranial range at the time of birth between 320 and 370 millimeters, and this woman would have given birth to a child that's about 318, well within or close to that range. So we see serious overlap between these, Homo erectus and Neanderthals, but how different were they? What were they? This is the big question, okay? These people existed. If they were true people, who were they? Well, through time, there's been a lot of changing theories with regard to this. And I think this diagram does well in illustrating this. I pulled this out of a Journal of Creation article. You can see the title there. Here you go, 1955, upper left-hand corner, 1955. The general belief is that Australopithecines evolved into like Homo erectus and then evolved into Homo sapiens. That's a general scheme that kind of connects these. But you have the A means Australopithecines, right? So something evolved into Australopithecines, which evolved into Homo erectus, and then Neanderthals and Homo sapiens branched off from there and evolved separately into individual species. 1967, Australopithecines evolved into Homo erectus. That evolved into Neanderthals, that evolved into Homo sapiens. Okay, 1971. Something evolved into the Australopithecines and or Homo habilis. Now, Australopithecines at this point considered a side group that did not evolve into Homo sapiens, but Homo habilis instead put forth as a leading contender of who would have evolved into Homo erectus, which evolved into Neanderthals, but Homo sapiens were a separate lineage from both of those. 1980, Australopithecines evolved into Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and this is still kind of where they kind of are citing here. A lot of changing theories through time, but one that was kind of one that's even a little bit more puzzling is this. The difference between the two main views of evolutionary ancestry referred to as the multi-regional theory and the out of Africa theory. Okay, multi-regional versus out of Africa. And this kind of works like this. And this isn't the best diagram, but you're going to have to suffer through it, unfortunately. The multi-regional theory works like this. Now, the color-coded, you can see the various areas where Homo erectus has been found. Okay, Africa, Europe, Asia, and even over Oceania, the area there around Australia, the islands of Australia. So the argument is that about 1 million years ago, Homo erectus first evolved in Africa, and then these populations migrated to various regions around the world where we now see Homo erectus. So Australopithecines evolved in Homo erectus in Africa, and then these Homo erectus populations migrated to all these areas where we currently find them, Europe, Asia, etc. And there, in these areas, each of these Homo erectus populations evolved into modern Homo sapiens. Okay, that's been a long-standing view. But recently, this was called the multi-regional theory. Okay, can we find Homo erectus populations in these various areas? And it makes sense that these Homo erectus populations would have kept evolving and would have evolved into modern Homo sapiens. But recently this has been overturned, and now most people have shifted to this, what we call the out of Africa theory, which goes like this. So Australopithecines evolved into Homo erectus in Africa, and then these African Homo erectus populations migrated in these various areas where they started to evolve, but then something happened and boom, all of them died off or something. But this population from Africa that kept evolving eventually evolved into Homo sapiens, and then those Homo sapiens migrated and colonized these various areas. Very weird. Very weird. Why these died off, and I don't know, very weird. Marvin Lubenow makes a fairly strong case, can't say how solid it is, that a lot of this initial movement towards this view was an attempt by some evolutionists to kind of throw off the racism that had always been part of the evolutionary theory behind human origins, that these various populations around the globe could be viewed as more or less evolved. And there had been strong overtones there. I mean, the Aborigines in Australia, there have been even people put into museums. There's a famous story of a person from Congo who was put in, I believe it was Congo, who was put into a museum. This person even put into a museum for a period of time. They actually hunted the Aborigines, literally collecting specimens, paid to kill Aborigines and for museum specimens, because they were viewed as less evolved. So, and he makes a case for this. Could be true, there could be some basis for it or not. Can't really speak to that. But this view, this out of Africa view, that Homo sapiens that evolved in Africa and migrated to these various regions was bolstered or substantiated by mitochondrial Eve studies. I wanted to find you a magazine cover so you could remember mitochondria Eve. It was big news originally. Genetic studies have revealed that all humans have evolved from one female, and they called that female mitochondrial Eve. And some people, that sounds good, they like the Bible and stuff. So I kind of jumped on that. Now, what these studies are, I'm going to come back to this, okay, because there's something kind of interesting here. But what they have found, they've studied the DNA. Mitochondria is one of the little, what they call an organelle in your cells. So just like you have organs in your body, there are little microscopic organelles in your cells, and one of them is called the mitochondria. Now, most of your DNA is in the nucleus, but there's two organelles, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, that have DNA in them. And that's because these are massive chemical factories that need tons and tons of protein, and so they just have all their code right there. So mitochondria has its own little DNA, okay? And the vast majority of the mitochondria you have come from your mother. That's because the egg cell is really big, the sperm is really small, so there's a lot of mitochondria in the egg, very little mitochondria by comparison. So the vast majority of mitochondria comes from mother. So what they have done is they sequence the mitochondria of various groups. Okay, so I sequenced the mitochondria of this group, and I sequenced the mitochondria of this group and found a mutation, a genetic change in this group, and then I sequenced the mitochondria of this group over here, and I find the same genetic change and one more. And then from another group over there, I find those two genetic changes, one more. By comparing these genetic changes, these mutations of mitochondrial DNA of the various living populations, they've come up with this migratory pattern that illustrates that humans have all come from one place and have migrated throughout the world. Okay, and this is very much bolstered the whole out of Africa theory. Now, these are not, again, not Homo erectus DNA sequences that they're analyzing here, but modern human populations. Okay, but there's something very interesting there, and I want to come back to it in just a second. So forgive me as I wander off and come back. I want to show you something. There's actually something very cool there. Now, one of the probably the biggest problems with this, all of this, is Marvin Lubenow pointed out in his book, is that we have found modern human fossils contemporaneously with alongside not only Neanderthals, but also Homo erectus and even Australopithecines, almost back to the very beginning. I know you can't see this diagram very well, but these are modern timeline of where we find modern Homo sapiens, all the way back, you know, close to 3.5, 4 million years ago. Neanderthals, only a little batch of Neanderthals there. Homo erectus, that's where we find the Homo erectus fossils. Here's Australopithecines. But we have found modern Homo sapien fossils alongside all of these, almost all the way back to the very beginning. And yet, what evolutionists expect is you should only find Australopithecines, you know, and then eventually you should find Homo erectus, and eventually you should find modern Homo sapiens. But we find modern Homo sapiens fossils alongside all of these, you know, seriously challenging this whole view. Lubenow. My own conclusion, he says, as to who these were. Who were these Neanderthals, Homo erectus? My conclusion, he says, is that Homo erectus and Neanderthals are actually the same. They're the same. Homo erectus is at the lower end with regard to size of a continuum. That includes Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals. The range of cranial capacities for fossil humans is in line with the cranial capacities for modern humans. They were just the same. Peter Line argues the same and says that if this is true, then that means there's just an enormous gap, not just a missing link, but a missing cavern between Australopithecines and modern or the genus Homo. He says, without the burden of having to fit fossils into an evolutionary scheme, there's no reason not to accept fossils such as those categorized as erectus and Neanderthals as belonging to the one humankind. If fossils such as those categorized as Homo erectus and Neanderthals were fully human, then the case for human evolution essentially collapses, and there's an unbridgeable morphological gap between the Australopithecine apes and these humans. Enormous gap. If we're correct on this, Homo erectus and Neanderthals are just humans, then there's an enormous gap between those and the Australopithecines. They make them look more ape-like. They make the Australopithecines look more human-like as a way of trying to bridge that gap. But when these are finally analyzed and we realize just how human-like these Neanderthals and Homo erectus are, just how ape-like these Australopithecines are, this gap is enormous, So who were they? The general view from the creation community is that both your Homo erectus and Neanderthals, although you'll see some disagreement here, these are post-flood humans. These are people that lived after the flood. Okay, so, and Peter Line actually gives several possible factors that could have contributed to the differences in their morphology, in their anatomy. Why did they look different? Okay, he gives a few possibilities. He says, perhaps greater genetic diversity and genetic drift within the humankind in the past. True, could be. They were living under particularly harsh environmental conditions after the flood, during the Ice Age. Very, very hard times, very, very hard living. Dietary habits would be very poor. It would have taken centuries before they could start farming again. Topsoils were decimated by the flood. And you get your pioneer species come in first. Nitrogen fixers in the lot come in first. Eventually, generations after generation, you finally get enough topsoil to where you could actually start growing crops. So nutrient deficiency could play a role. Poor dietary habits. I mean, when you're eating nothing but mammoth, you know, for months, you know, kill a big mammoth and you're on mammoth stew and mammoth steaks and mammoth sausage in the morning. Yeah, lots of mammoth. Stress of particular biomechanical forces. Now, what he's referring to here is the fact that humans have historically used things like their teeth for tools. I mean, God's given us a lot of tools, and your teeth are one of those. Without the advantage of having some needle-nose pliers or vise that you can lock some stuff into, use your teeth. So when you're trying to create, strands or leather strips or anything, you put that in your mouth, and then you hold that while you and that very act, that very act of using your jaw as a tool, as a vice like that, would cause changes. Now, unknown to most people, your skeletal system is constantly remodeling itself. You have cells that are constantly eating away at bone, and then other cells come back and constantly add new bone. Osteoblasts or osteoclasts are eating away at your bone, and then osteoblasts come back and lay new bone down. And they do this not just during repair, but as a way of rejuvenating your bone and remodeling it based on current needs. Okay? So you've heard people say, "Oh, I'm not fat, I'm just big boned." You hear people say this, "I'm just big boned," you know what I mean? Well, this is true in one way, but you're big boned because you're big. When you put on more mass, your bones will remodel themselves to help with that additional stress that's being placed upon them. Or people that are involved in some physical activity that requires a lot of real tension on your bone, the bones will be reinforced, will be strengthened. If you ever have a chance, look at someone that like is a professional rock climber. If you ever have a chance to look at someone that's involved in something that's very, very strenuous on bone like that, look at their hand. You see all the additional bone development, knuckles on a person that's involved in that kind of stuff. Your bones are constantly remodeling themselves. So possibility. He mentions a pathology, disease causes a lot of changes, possibly. But I think one of the most compelling is this, longevity. One of the most compelling. Remember that before the flood, people lived to be hundreds of years old, 800-900 years old up until the flood. And then the lifespan, the longevity of humans fell off gradually after the flood. Now, when God says he's going to destroy the world by flood, just before he says, I'm going to destroy the world by flood, he says, man shall not live but to 120 years. Because I'm going to destroy the world by flood. And it appears to me from that statement that one of the intended consequences of the flood was not just to wipe out the wickedness of the human race that then existed, but was to reduce the human lifespan from what it was before, 800 years or so, down to 120, which is the medical max. I did a little search for it and found like a record of one woman who'd said she had lived to 121. Otherwise, 120 is the medical max. You can get there, but barely there. Moses himself died at 120. So it tapered off gradually, okay? And your bones, again, are constantly remodeling themselves, constantly growing throughout your life. So the question is, what would a person look like? What would a skeleton of a person look like who was 400 years old? And if that person died alongside someone who's 35 years old, could that just be enough of an explanation? You got a modern Homo sapien alongside someone that's 400 years old, even though they're brothers, or could be just as simple as that. It's a compelling thought. One can't entirely explain it though, because I can't speak to this with any authority, okay? But they do find adolescent fossils that they can identify as Neanderthal. The one that I showed you before, the diagram that Jack Quozo had found was of an adolescent that they had found. They can find them and can identify them as Neanderthal. And I can't speak with any authority as to whether or not cranial thickness is part of that identification or it's simply the brow ridges. So there's a genetic difference as well. I mean, there is a genetic difference between after sequencing the Neanderthal genome. There's a genetic difference. So they were separate populations. So I can't give you the entire story, okay, but definitely some pieces of it I think we're understanding. And again, if we want to know the true history, what's important, what's critical is that we interpret scientific findings ourselves, consistent with the biblical worldview. And that's what we're trying to do. And you look to people that are experts in those fields that are doing this from the biblical worldview as a way of helping, okay? Let me show you one more thing. I told you I was going to come back to this map. I'm bleeding out, losing a little bit of my color here. Let me see if I can help you with this. Losing some of this. This is not as brown as this should be. Neanderthals are all up in here. This map shows you, it's the same map that I showed you of the mitochondrial Eve study, but overlaid on top of the Homo erectus and Neanderthal ranges, okay? All the yellow is where Homo erectus has been found, all the yellow, but this, in my on mine is brown, darker brown right here. So Neanderthals have been found all in this region. Remember, they haven't found Neanderthals over in Asia, which was kind of puzzling when we found that there had been interbreeding between those groups, okay? So Neanderthals over here, Homo erectus over here, and the red shows you where they have the mitochondrial Eve studies that show the radiation that they believe happened of modern Homo sapiens. So after Homo erectus, evolved in Homo sapiens. But I just want to show you something cool about this diagram. The key point here is this branch right here, okay? That little branch point right here I think is kind of key on this diagram because I want to show you something. Okay, watch this. This is the location of Mount Ararat, where the ark would have landed. Okay, now I want to show you something else. This is the location, best I could put it on this map, the location of the Tower of Babel, right here. Interesting, right? Very interesting that we find a branch point right there. And also what the mitochondrial Eve study indicate was that there are 3 main mitochondrial Eve lineages. 3 main lineages. Noah's sons, 3 wives. 3 main mitochondrial Eve lineages that all branched out from right that point right there. What an interesting parallel with the biblical narrative when properly understood from within that context, okay? One last March of Progress diagram for you to send you home. Someone sent me this recently. I had to slip it in there. Yeah. All right. All right. Let me close out in a word of prayer. Father, we are so thankful that we have your word, that this tremendous book has been given to your people and passed to us in such a way that would give us such insight. Father, we ask for wisdom. Your word says you give generously to all who ask, Father, and we ask for wisdom. We live in a world where misinformation is the norm. Everyone that we know, the population is lost, does not know the true history of the world, Father. Give us wisdom to help us weed through this information, sift through this information to find the bits of truths that are out there, to help us understand the world that we live in, Father, and to the end to help us be a better witness, a better servant for you, so that when we witness to people about your creation, about your Son, about the salvation message and the plan that you have for us, and they have questions about the history that conflicts with the Bible, that we have the answers to give them. Give us wisdom so that we can better serve you, Father, and be in testifying of your grace and your glory. Father, we praise you. Father, we thank you. Father, we glorify and honor you. Ask for these things in Christ's name. Amen.